It's a great pleasure to welcome one of the world's leading historians to Nettavisen. Welcome, Anthony Beevor.
Thank you very much indeed.
Your book on Russia and the Russian Revolution is now translated to Norwegian, and it's only feels right to see it in the view of the current situation. How do you see Vladimir Putin with historians' glasses?
We're seeing a very strange situation because we're into, I think, what one could describe as the Second Cold War. The whole of the 20th century was dominated by the Russian Revolution and Civil War, which created the great split between left and right, between fascism and communism, all the way through the Spanish Civil War, the Second World War. But now, after all of that period ending in 1989, we are now seeing a fresh conflict developing, as one would describe the Second Cold War, with both Putin and the rise of China and the threat really from President Xi on Taiwan and the South China Sea and so forth. And this actually is in many ways an extension of the Cold War of the past, but it is also a new era of geopolitics. The left versus right split has now converted or has altered direction towards the split between authoritarianism and democracy. And we're seeing in Ukraine, with many, I think almost definitely, the disintegration of the Russian army. This may have an influence really on the future. But the worrying aspect, I think, of this Second Cold War is the way that geopolitics are changing so rapidly, that even in the First Cold War, Russian leaders and Chinese leaders would stick with agreements. If they made a promise, they would keep to it. We're not seeing that anymore, and I think we are seeing a far more chaotic era developing where traditional diplomacy, for example, is not going to work. We cannot trust Putin to stick to anything that he says. He changes his mind the whole time. It will probably be seen as one of the greatest self-inflicted disasters in history, the way that he has achieved the exact opposite of everything he set out to do. But that does not mean that the world is much safer. If anything, the world is in a far more dangerous position because of his mistakes. And I think that this is really what we need to focus on most of all.
How do you see this play out? What will happen?
Well, I don't think that anybody is in a position really to see how it will play out, because there are so many different possibilities. Putin might well be replaced within the Kremlin by, say, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who's the leader of Wagner, the Wagner group, which is the only force which is operating with a reasonable element of success. I mean, the Russian army is disintegrating otherwise, partly because the troops are badly trained, they're not properly equipped. The recent increase with the conscription is utterly disastrous. So from that point of view, we may well suddenly see Putin in old Soviet style being sent off to the sanatorium, as they used to say, while they decide who's going to take over. But we are not going to see a 1917 February revolution in the streets. That's impossible to see, because for a revolution to take place on the street, it really depends on the apathy or the collapse of willpower of the ruling elite. And they know perfectly well they've got nowhere to go, except perhaps for Qatar or Dubai, into exile. And the other thing is that, of course, the real key element is going to be Crimea. Because for the Russians, not just Putinistas, but I mean for almost all Russians, Crimea, with the history of Catherine the Great, Potemkin, and Sevastopol, is intensely Russian and therefore an existential element which Putin has already spoken about. But Zelensky is determined to have Crimea back. And the British and Americans just literally in the last few days have started to change their position, which seems to indicate that they're going to allow Zelensky to take back Crimea. So the war may take longer than we thought. It is not just a question of expelling Russians from traditional Ukrainian territory. There are many other sort of possibilities which could take place, and especially I'm not worried about, for example, a nuclear battlefield weapon being used to terrify the West or frighten the Ukrainians. I think that's unlikely, because I think pressure from Xi, who would be terrified by that, because he does not want to have nuclear weapons associated, especially with the whole question of Taiwan. He would be terrified about the idea of the Americans providing a nuclear-tipped cruises missiles, say, for example, to the Taiwanese. But I think that we could certainly see the use of chemical weapons in a demonstration that the stage of the war has been reached where the Russians know, and Putin knows, that he can't win in Ukraine. So it's a policy, a strategy of destruction and revenge. And we're seeing this with the smashing of the cities with missiles and drones. And they could add, with Zurikin, the general who commanded in Syria, the use of chemical weapons as well. We know that they've got the cruder version of chemical weapons. They've also got sarin, and that would be simply terrifying, and actually as appalling in its own humanitarian consequences, almost as a nuclear weapon.
You said that it's a far more dangerous situation, and you also written a lot of books on the Second World War. Mm-hmm. With the Norwegian or British perspective, how worried should we be for our own lives? Do you see a third World War coming?
We cannot rule it out. Obviously, one hopes that nothing of the sort will happen. But we are in a very unstable world, and this is the problem, as I was mentioning, about the lack of rules and the change in the way that traditional diplomacy doesn't seem to be working anymore. The idea that one can trust Putin or an agreement with Putin is impossible. So really the only solution to the war is, as I say, the disintegration of the Russian army, and then a guarantee to Ukraine, which is equivalent to NATO Article 5, so that, Ukraine can be rebuilt with a sort of Marshall Plan type of investment, and so that Ukraine can actually then be in a position to defend itself, whether or not it actually eventually becomes a member of NATO or not. But there is also another worrying development, which is the possible disintegration of Russia itself if its own army starts to disintegrate. And that would be another humanitarian disaster. So, nobody can actually work out how it's going to work out, how it's going to end. But all one can say is there are many different dangers in different directions.
We're very happy to have used a lot of your time here in Norway, but I would like to have the historical back to 1917,
yes.
when you have a revolution and you have the end of the Tsar family, mm-hmm. and very short period of time has been democratic in Russia, if at all. How do you see you talked about the conflict between democracy and
authoritarianism.
Right. Do you think that historical events are really shaping the history, so Russia can't be democratic?
Well, the argument has always been, whether by the Tsars or by the Soviet leaders, that Russia is such a vast country that therefore you have to have a very strong man in command and in sort of central power. And there's always been a fear of civil war. One has to remember at Stalin's funeral, even those who'd been in the Gulag, who'd suffered under Stalin, were crying in fear because they feared another civil war. And so it has dominated Russian history and the Russian mentality. It is a very, very powerful folk memory, which actually Putin has been quite clever in the way that he's played it in the past. The chance for democracy after the revolution was always going to be a difficult one, partly because the whole mechanism of the state had collapsed during the February Revolution. The police had been chased away, in the countryside there was no further control. So the Democrats, both the moderate conservatives from the Duma as well as the Petrograd socialists, who were comparatively moderate, I mean far more moderate than the Bolsheviks who came later, they're working together into the provisional government of the time, stood no chance because they needed to have the Constituent Assembly, the only hope of real democracy, up and running in a very short space of time. But that was impossible. They had ministers, but none of them had real control of any sort. And unfortunately, they then had Kerensky as their leader, who was more of a fantasist than a pragmatic politician. And although a brilliant speaker, he had no sense of the reality of power and had completely underestimated the Bolshevik threat. And that was why it was so easy, in a way, for the Bolsheviks to launch their coup d'etat in October. Herzen, the great Alexander Herzen in the 19th century, had predicted this particular problem, which he referred to as the pregnant widow, the inability, if you like, to create a regime between the death of one and the birth of the new. And this was very much the case. And in a way, I think it's sort of almost the difficulty in Russia, where the country is so much more a prisoner of its past than any other country. And as I think every time it's tried to escape that past, it's been pulled back into it. And we see this, I'm afraid, with Putin.
One last question. How do you see Putin in the lights of Lenin and Stalin? Is it going to be a historical, very important person if you look 100 years in?
He will be a very significant person in the sense that nobody has achieved such a disaster, such a self-inflicted disaster in history. So in that case, in comparison to Lenin and Stalin, who in their own particular ways, Lenin as a political leader and as a revolutionary leader and achiever of power, showed an extraordinary genius, an evil genius, yes. Stalin as a war leader who started off disastrously but then became a very effective war leader, far more so than Hitler, who actually became worse and worse. Funny enough, Hitler and Putin both started micromanaging the conduct of the war with disastrous consequences. So, I mean, Putin will be remembered, I think, as I say, the greatest disaster, if you like, certainly in Russian history, if not in world history, in what he has done to his own country. And I think that this is one of the great fears of the effect it will have on Russia and the feelings of Russians in the future. Maybe they too will have a feeling of which the Germans had after the First World War, that somehow they were stabbed in the back, and there was a sense of betrayal. But there's going to be a terrible bitterness. Thank
you very much for listening.
Thank you very much.